Hello and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're having a look at the second and last boss in the Crucible of Storms, Uu'nat, Harbinger of the Void.
Yes, so this 3-phase boss is pretty damn unique, as it reuses a fair amount of abilities from the first boss, but instead modifies them in such a way where instead of him casting them, you have to cast them instead.
So the raid has access to the 3 relics from the previous fight. They can be found at the entrance to the boss room, but cannot be picked up until the fight begins. Each relic can only be picked up by a player of the correct role, and when they have been picked up, they'll give you access to an extra action button ability, which you will then use to counter some of the boss's abilities throughout the fight. Now when you have used a relic and its spell has ended, you will then drop the relic on the ground and you won't be able to pick it up again for 2 minutes as it leaves a debuff on you. So you need to make sure that you drop relics in easy to get to places so that it can be picked up again later. The relic will remain on the ground and begin to recharge energy. The time it does take to get full energy back does depend on the relic. So starting us off, tanks can pick up and use the Trident of Deep Ocean, and this takes 2 minutes to recharge. This makes a shield around the tank which redirects 75% of the damage taken by players within it to the shield itself. Now the shield does have a health pool, so it can only take so much damage. After 20 seconds, the shield will explode, dealing damage to the raid equal to the remaining health of the shield. So the raid needs to make sure that they deplete the entire health pool of the shield whenever it is activated so that you don't get one shot. Healers can pick up and use the Void Stone, and this takes 1 minute to recharge. This applies a damage absorption shield to the healer, and whilst this shield holds, all players and enemies are immune to healing. This should only be used to counter times in which the boss or his adds will heal, and only if the raid can go without healing during this time. The healer might need to deliberately go out of the way to take damage to remove the damage shield and the healing immunity along with it once they have countered the boss's ability successfully. Now DPS can pick up and use the Tempest Caller, and this only takes 30 seconds to recharge. This will deal damage to all players and enemy adds every 3 seconds over 15 seconds. This also reduces the damage players deal by 50% throughout the channel. If this deals damage to a player or an enemy add who is below 25% health, it will instantly kill them, and any adds killed in this way will not trigger their death effects. Now most adds in the encounter do something horrible when they die or just cannot be killed at all without this relic, so you need to make sure that all adds are low enough so that they will die within the 15-second window, whilst also making sure that all players remain above 25% health to avoid the insta-kill. So with all of these relics out the way, let's have a look at the fight from the beginning.
So the boss has an energy bar which passively fills over time. Once he reaches 100% energy, he will cast a powerful Gift of Nosov spell which changes depending on what phase you're in. For phase 1 this is Obscurity. It deals a burst of damage to your raid and then creates a ring of void around the room. Standing within the ring deals a ton of damage, so you'll want to avoid it. Each time this spell is cast, the ring of void will get bigger, reducing the space you have to work in. Now although you could just sit in the middle of the room and pretty much ignore this mechanic, you will quickly run out of space as the middle of the room gets covered with other abilities such as the Oblivion tier. When this is cast, the boss will mark an area underneath a random player and spawn a void zone. Moving into this deals damage and will knock you back, whilst also healing the boss for 1% of his maximum health. These zones will stay on the ground until someone eventually runs into them, and as you really don't want to run into them, we found that standing towards the edges of the void to be the best, as it keeps the room that you're forced into later as clear as possible. Now these zones can be cleared without healing the boss by using the Void Stone from your healers. We found that doing this during phase 1 was a bit hectic and a little bit dangerous, and not needed either as you still have enough space for the phase and can deal with it later. The boss will also cast Void Crash. This works identically to the one found in the Restless Cabal fight earlier on in the instance, with a zone being marked before exploding. If nobody was in there, it will reduce in size and bounce somewhere else. If somebody does take the hit, they will take a burst of damage and the Void Crash will be removed. Just like the previous fight, you'll want to remove these when it's safe to do so by having a single player take one hit. One of the major things to deal with during phase 1 is the 2 different eye abilities. The Maddening Eyes of Nosov will mark several areas with a hard to distinguish pattern on the ground. A few moments later, anyone within these areas will take a burst of damage and become hostile to allies for 6 seconds. This hostile effect, for people that don't know, will make it so they cannot receive any healing from others can attack you, and as a hostile player you can also attack them back. Of course you do not want to attack your hostile allies and they really shouldn't attack you back. Instead, if you ever are caught, you want to make sure that you move away from any accidental cleave attacks towards the boss and just stay out of harm's way until you go back to normal. As for the Piercing Gaze of Nosov, this will create 2 beams which will cross over the encounter area from 2 different directions, and they will always intersect at a right angle. Touching a beam does a small amount of initial damage, but leaves a pretty nasty 4-second dot. You'll want to let this dot expire before you get hit by the second beam, as it will stack in both duration and damage. This is done by quickly looking to see where the beams are before passing through one as soon as possible. Let your dot drop and then passing through the next. Classes with blink-like abilities can also avoid the beams by using those spells, but one thing to note before you think about it, Warlock gateways didn't seem to work. Now the last thing to worry about in this phase is the tank kit and the adds that spawn throughout the phase. An Undying Guardian will spawn at the edge of the room every now and then. This ad needs to be kept at least 10 yards away from the boss at all times, otherwise the boss will take 99% less damage. These ads just simply melee hit the tank, and they also do more damage the higher health they have. Once they reach 1 HP, they will begin to regenerate, going dormant and then gaining health back at an ever increasing rate. Once they reach full health again, they will reactivate completely and start melee hitting the tank once more. We found that simply multi-dotting the ads throughout the phase was more than enough to get them to the 25% health mark. You don't necessarily want to kill them and force them to regenerate health, as you'll need to do the damage all over again to get them low, so you can eventually kill them off using the Tempest Caller DPS relic. At the end of the phase, we just so happened to have 3 of these guys up, and we used the time between phase 1 and 2 to use the relic and finish them off, as there's very few other mechanics going on which could potentially bring players down to low health, enough for them to be one-shot by the Tempest Caller relic. Now whilst tanking the boss, it's very important that you're always facing him away from the raid, because he will cast Touch of the End, which is a frontal cone which applies a 24-second dot. This dot forces all Undying Guardians to fixate you, forcing a tank swap, as otherwise the boss will gain the damage reduction. We found that having the tank swap positions was actually better than moving the boss around, as otherwise you'll have a moment where the boss and ads pass over one another, which will trigger the damage reduction briefly. Now when the boss reaches 70% health, he will run into the edge of the room and take 99% less damage for 20 seconds, whilst he does some RP. As already mentioned, we use this time to kill off the ads with the Tempest Caller, as everyone can remain stacked up, which helps out your healers. The Ring of the Void will now also reset to its initial position, giving you all of your space back. After the Tempest Caller had ended and all the players were healthy again, it was at this point we decided to use the Void Stone to make the boss healing immune, whilst we soaked up all the Oblivion Tear Void Zones from phase 1 to completely reset the room ready for phase 2.
Now in phase 2, the boss loses access to his Piercing Gaze and Maddening Eyes of Nosov abilities, as well as his Void Crash ability. He will still spawn Oblivion Tears and Undying Guardians, as well as hit the tank with the Touch of the End. One new ability in this phase is the Unknowable Terror. A large section of the room will be marked with a dark purple zone, and 8 seconds later, all players within the area will take a large burst of damage and be feared for 6 seconds, so simply move out of the zone. The boss will spawn 3 primordial mindbenders every minute. These 3 ads will spawn across the room and will cast Consume Essence. If this cast goes uninterrupted, the raid will take a burst of damage and the ad will heal to full. You just need to make sure that they're interrupted so that they can be killed. You can use CC such as stuns and displacements to help out with this. When the mindbenders die, they'll spawn several little mind spawn ads, which simply just melee hit whoever has threat. When these little ads die, they do a burst of damage to the entire raid. Enough damage that if you kill all ads that spawn from the 3 mindbenders all at once, the raid will be one-shot. Now if the mindbenders or the mind spawns are killed using the Tempest Caller relic, their on-death effects will not trigger. Now as they spawn every minute and the Tempest Caller takes 30 seconds to recharge, it is possible to kill each set of mindbenders with the relic, thus not spawning any mind spawns at any point. This would lead to a 25% uptime on the 50% damage reduction on the raid, reducing boss damage significantly. So alternatively, you might want to use the Tempest Caller for every other set of mindbender spawns. This would mean that the mind spawns would be active and moving around for a while, which isn't the end of the world as they can be kited pretty easily. Now one thing that makes kiting and ad killing in general more difficult in this phase is the Gift of Nosov cast. Instead of bringing the Ring of Void closer, the Gift of Nosov now heals all ads for 75% of their maximum health, as well as buffing them with a 50% haste and movement speed increase. You need to make sure that the boss will not cast this while you're killing off any of the Mindbenders or Undying Guardians with the Tempest Caller, as the Tempest Caller channel might time out before any of the ads die. And this is the main difficulty in this phase, trying to figure out exactly when you're going to kill the ads so that you don't get overwhelmed. The 50% haste buff makes tanks take a hell of a lot more damage from the Guardians, especially if they're tanking a lot of them at once. This did end up being our problem during testing, as we were unable to make it out of phase 2, and from what we can gather from other guilds, this was kind of their problem as well. But with that said, we can still have a look at what happens in the last phase via the dungeon journal.
So in the last phase, the boss loses access to the Unknowable Terror and will no longer spawn any of the Mindbenders. The boss will, however, still spawn the Oblivion Tears and Guardians, whilst forcing the tank to still swap with a touch of the end cone. The piercing gaze beams from phase 1 will also make a return. Now the gift of Nosov in this phase, as well as doing a burst of raid-wide damage, will now cause all players to become hostile to allies for 5 seconds. This is going to be rough, as you're not going to be able to heal anyone for 5 seconds just after that burst of damage has come in. And all DPS that have passive cleave need to be extremely careful, as otherwise they're just going to cleave damage to all tanks and nearby melee. You'll definitely want everyone to be at max health before this comes in. You may even need to use some form of raid-wide damage reduction just to make sure that, you know, the raid doesn't die. But more importantly, tanks, you may need to use some form of big cooldown as well, because you're not going to be healed at all. A new debuff that is placed out in this phase is called the Insatiable Torment. This deals ticking damage to the player and makes them immune to healing. Whilst they have the debuff, they would do damage to any players within 5 yards. This damage is the only way players can get their health back, as it actually siphons health from anyone nearby. With the current tooltip numbers, you need one other player to siphon from to counteract the ticking damage from the debuff, but it's entirely possible that you're going to need more than that, because of course there's other sources of damage coming in that you need to heal up. But aside from that, it doesn't seem like there's much more going on in this phase. It looks like it's just going to be a race to kill the boss before too many players get the Insatiable Torment debuff, and there just isn't enough players to siphon from. But before we end the video, what do we think?
So I'm a massive fan of fights that give you a wide range of choices and these big tools that you get to kind of choose by yourself exactly when you want to do it in terms of your strategy. That's really cool. A couple of little things I noticed during testing that kind of got my nitpicking going a little bit. Some of the graphics, especially the maddening eyes of Nosov, was a little bit iffy.
It's not super clear, yeah.
Yeah, it's super hard to distinguish, but in this room, it's like a lightish sort of purple on like a kind of similar coloured floor, and there's like bubbles within it, and it looks like if you stayed within the bubbles, because it's the same colour as the floor, you'd be safe, but no, you have to move completely away from that entire space. It's not a very clear mechanic. When we initially did it, quite a few people got caught out because we didn't even see it was on the floor. And normally that shouldn't be a difficult part of the fight, trying to see where something is, you know? That shouldn't be the hard part. Moving from it should be the hard part.
Another thing to sort of mention as well with the fight is the healing relic. The damage absorption shield that it applies to the healer that uses it is gigantic, to the point where it's really hard to actually remove it.
Maybe that's supposed to be a difficulty thing.
Because if you actually go and soak one of the Oblivion Tears, it did like no damage.
Yeah. You needed
to soak like 50 of them to remove the shield. There isn't 50, and instead you was forced to go and stand in all the void around the outsides of the room.
Which isn't ideal, because then someone else needs to go and pick it up. Yeah.
And well, yeah, they want to go pick it up. They have to like almost go into that goo to go pick it up.
I wonder if it would be worth taunting the boss, like putting on healers that can taunt, like druids and monks and paladins.
Yeah, but then again, that stops you from using 5 priests if you wanted to have 5 priests.
Yeah, maybe they could reduce it.
They just need to make it so those tears do damage, or make it so like the absorption shield's tiny.
Which is quite funny. It's like, make it so my damage shield is worth less, so it makes the fight easier.
Yeah.
Which you wouldn't normally hear. But yeah, I suppose so. It was quite difficult to get off with the current damage numbers, I agree. Maybe it won't be so bad if you're stood right at the edge. Maybe that's what you're supposed to do. Maybe that's what they had in mind. But
it just seems a little odd that it's that way.
One of my favourite mechanics in the fight, generally speaking, though, is the double beams. It's
that's awesome.
Hallion me a little bit back in the Ruby Sanctum, which was like one of my... everyone hated that instance. I loved it. I loved that last boss. But the 2 beams crossing over is super cool, because it does give you classes that have like cool blink abilities. Normally you just use it to blink out of a mechanic, but you can kind of, time it, and if you get through both of the beams at once with a single blink, you feel like a god, which is awesome, And I think there's going to be a lot of room for players to show how fucking cool they are and good they are by using their class mechanics to dodge that sort of mechanic, because it does hurt a lot. Like, especially if you take 2 at once, you can very easily die. So yeah, I like that there's that sort of like outplay potential that isn't needed, but it's kind of there if you're cool.
Are you ready for the 15 mage world first?
God, don't. Talking of which, this fight seems super melee unfriendly.
Yeah, it's just another fight where there's a load of ads and Shadow Priests, Boomkins, Warlocks, Ellie Shamans.
Yeah.
It's just another fight where they're going to be absolutely insane.
Yeah. Oh, especially the hostile to allies thing. Like, you have to be super careful, because the tanks are always in melee, right? So you do have to be careful not to cleave onto them.
You just need to stop pressing chain lightning for a second.
Well, but some classes, just by doing damage, they kind of cleave around them a little bit anyway. So, but like having melee there as well, they're just very easily die or very easily cleave onto one another. So once again, it feels like unless melee have a specific job, you'll probably just have a Demon Hunter in, but even then that could be covered by a tank if Demon Hunter tanks exist anymore. I don't even remember. I haven't seen one in so long. But, you know, like if you'll probably have a Demon Hunter in, you might have a Warrior in, but right now I can't really see a job for anyone else. Like the Rogues can't go around and cheese things because if you soak any of the mechanics, it heals the boss. It's not the damage done to players that's the problem. It's the healing done to the boss.
Yeah.
So hopefully I'm wrong. I hate it when it's just completely stacked in one direction, but you can see quite a lot of guilds really focusing on those shadows, really focusing on those boomkins and stuff like that, because it does seem that these two encounters are very melee unfriendly, and they just seem to benefit multi-dot and long-range cleave DPS so highly, which isn't necessarily the end of the world, but it kind of sucks if you're a melee player a little bit. But one last thing before we end the video, do need to talk about the mythic mechanic they're bringing in. The main one, there's loads of different ones, but the main thing, they're bringing the Star Augur marks back.
Can't wait.
Oh boy.
This is going to be a 500 pull boss. I'm telling you now, it's going to be a 500
It's
pull
going to
boss.
be mental. I'm well looking forward to it. But either way, guys, that's where we're going to leave it for today. Thank you very much for watching. Of course, there will be a live updated guide for when this boss does reach live service, so keep an eye on the channel for that. But that's where we'll leave it for today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Catch you in the next one.